The motorcade with the vice president has arrived, so we're going to be keeping a close eye on you. We'll come back to Nashville as soon as the vice president is ready to speak. But right now, we want to go back to Austin, where Candy Crowley is with another of Governor Bush's media people. Candy?
I am, Judy, but let me first give you a little information about the phone call between the vice president and Governor Bush. I'm told that it took place about 2:30 this morning Eastern time. The vice president, of course, congratulated the governor. The governor said to the vice president that he was a formidable opponent and a good man. He then said, "We gave them," meaning the American people, a cliffhanger. Bush also told the vice president, "I understand that this is hard," and told him to be sure and give Mrs. Gore his best. So that's what we know about the phone call, which took place between the vice president and the governor just a little over a half an hour ago. Let me now talk and turn to Stu Stevens, media consultant for the Bush campaign. So how many emotions did you go through tonight?
Oh, about 4,000, up and down. But Carl was steady as a rock and kept it in.
And was there a point when you thought it's over?
No. I mean, the Florida always looked good. And the scenario for us to win with Florida was always there.
If you had to look back over the last 17 months and find a turning point when you thought, this is it, he's gonna become president, was there one?
The debates. He entered the debate slightly behind. It was the linchpin of the Gore strategy to win the debates and disqualify the governor. And the governor won every debate decisively.
And yet you had that September was a very sort of dark time for you. Did you feel like the debates turned that around then?
Yeah, it was a turning point in the campaign.
If there's a single quality, single issue, what was it that you think turned this ever so slightly, very small edge for the governor?
I think that the now President-elect Bush has a remarkable ability to connect with people and to relate to them. And I think that and his promise to change the tone and to really elevate the tone of politics in America, people responded to. And that was a consistency. He said it when he announced in Iowa last June, and he said it last night in Austin.
So tell the truth, have any of you all been talking about transition, moving to Washington, any of that stuff for the last couple of days?
I may be the only one, but no one's, I don't think so. No.
But there was an awful lot of confidence in this campaign over the last couple of days that some of us thought was beyond the empirical evidence that we saw. How much of that was real and how much of that was you've just got to have that confidence going in the last 2 days and send out that signal?
Well, I've learned the Texans are a confident bunch.
Okay, and certainly this governor is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Stu Stevens, media consultant for the Bush campaign. Back to you in Atlanta.
Thank you, Candy. As John King indicated, Vice President Al Gore's motorcade has arrived there outside the campaign headquarters in Nashville. The crowd is assembled. John says that Mr. Gore will likely make a very brief statement. Senator Joe Lieberman, the wives of both candidates will be with them. And then presumably after that's done, Governor Bush will appear in Austin, and we will have heard from both these men tonight in a very historic race.
That it certainly has been, and certainly the counting of the votes has almost been historic. I want to have our viewers and us take a quick look here at the state that turned the corner for George W. Bush, the state of Florida. Here it is with 99% of the precincts reporting. Look at those numbers. George W. Bush, right, about what, 11,000 votes ahead out of what, 5.6 million?
Almost 6 million votes. You got this is 1976 all over again, where Jimmy Carter won Ohio by a margin of about 10 or 11,000 votes, won Mississippi by about 15,000 votes, and that was the presidency. You're talking about less than an 11,000 vote margin out of 5.6 million votes.
And let's look at the Nader vote if we have it.
Look at the Nader vote. That's what I'm curious about.
We have it.
In the state of Florida. We have it, whether we can pull it up right now. Here
There it is. Wow.
All right, 95,000.
11,000 vote margin for Bush, and Nader gets 95,000 votes. I think one of the fingers of recrimination is going to be pointed at Ralph Nader.
Now,
and he doesn't care.
Just quickly, I know, Jeff, you want to say anything. Bill, of the 99% reporting, Does that include absentee and all these other things that we said were hanging out there that we didn't know about for so long?
I believe it does. I don't want to be held to that, but I believe it does.
So the 1% we haven't heard from is going to be it. I mean, that's going to...
When we have 100%, that is supposed to be it.
No, but you know what I mean. I mean, when the absentees over and above.
Yeah, well, they count the absentees, precinct county by county, and they report them along with the returns from the people who actually voted.
Just want to point out that if based on what we have found, or what you have found, you and your team, about the Nader vote, breaking about 6 to 1 for Bush, you can actually plausibly assert that if Florida cost Al Gore the presidency, Nader cost Al Gore Florida. You do the logic.
Therefore.
You're standing by in Nashville. And any talk there among the Gore people about a possible recount anywhere, especially given what we've just talked about, 11,000 votes?
We have to assume no, Bernie. Early on tonight, they were saying they were not raising that possibility because they thought they were going to win. And now we know that the vice president has called Governor Bush and wished him well and congratulated him on winning, and that he plans on making a very similar but brief public statement here. So we have to assume if the vice president were coming out to make a public concession speech, that he has no plans to challenge the results. Obviously, if some states' numbers came in differently than we believe them to be right now, that would change the circumstances. But if the vice president were actively planning to challenge the results, we assume he would say nothing tonight, or at least say that he was not prepared to concede defeat. But we are told he will indeed concede here just a few minutes from now. And you see the faces here, depression in the crowd here. And I was just thinking just moments ago, having conversations with senior Democrats in Washington this past week about what would Al Gore do if he lost this election. He has lost his home state of Tennessee, a very Republican state, and he is a man, even though he was the Democratic Party nominee, who does not have a lot of friends among the Democratic Party. And think back to past nominees who have lost. My first presidential campaign, Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts, a man who has become a mystery man in Democratic circles and in political circles. Al Gore must facing a very tough night tonight, having come so close to winning his dream. This is the son, of course, of a legendary senator here. His father said years ago his son was born to be president. Tonight his son came up just short.
Well, John, it's Bill Schneider. I want to ask you a fairly delicate question. People will blame lots of forces on this narrow defeat. You mentioned Gore's weakness in the southern border states. My question is this: has anyone ever mentioned the possibility of an anti-Semitic backlash among some Americans? Has the campaign ever considered that might materialize, and they might be seeing it in those southern and border states and in states in the West as one possible factor in his defeat?
It was discussed right after the choice was made in speculation, and most of the Gore campaign people said privately they did not believe that would be the case. And in the final days, we have heard no discussion of that. And in the southern states, and even in states like West Virginia and Kentucky, one of the reasons we have seen, or two reasons, I guess, we have seen the vice president struggle. One, Governor Bush made quite a bit, and so did anti-environmental groups, or at least energy industry groups, making the case that his environmental record was too extreme and would cost jobs in coal country in places like West Virginia and Kentucky. And Governor Bush, and the Gore people give him credit for this, was able to frame through the debates, make the case that Al Gore was a big spending liberal, not a DLC New Democrat. So there will be some finger pointing at Ralph Nader, again some finger pointing at Bill Clinton, especially when you look at elderly voters. The Roosevelt elderly have passed on. These are now Eisenhower elderly, is in the words of one top Gore campaign official, and they may support the Democrats on Medicare and Social Security, but they are more culturally conservative. And to see Governor Bush and the vice president split the elderly vote in Florida tells you a lot about what happened tonight. But also remember, 3 presidential debates, 3 debates in which the vice president was believed to have the advantage, even among his own senior staff. They say 3 debates in which the best he did was perhaps a draw or a slight victory in the 3rd debate. By then, Governor Bush had done quite well by himself, and his aides, the Texans' aides, believe, had positioned himself to win this race.
John King, having said all that, to what extent do the Gore people think, if it hadn't been for the whole Monica Lewinsky affair, that Al Gore would have been in much, much stronger shape going into this election?
Oh, I think not only just in the Gore campaign, Judy, throughout the Democratic Party and certainly within the Republican Party, almost the universal view that this vice president would have been a prohibitive favorite had the president not been impeached, because of the effect that had. It brought a challenge from Bill Bradley in the primaries. It didn't turn out to be much of a serious challenge, but it did siphon off time and resources. In the view of many of those moderate to conservative Democrats, it pushed Al Gore to the left, and a lot of discussion, a lot of distress in the Democratic Party, of course, in the months after Al Gore clinched the nomination, that he let Governor Bush seize the center back. But certainly, you're asked about the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Had the president not been impeached, this would have been a vice president who could have run on a record of 22 million new jobs, deficits turned into surpluses as far as the eye could see. Pretty hard to beat. Of course, most people thought President Bush would be pretty hard to beat coming out of the Gulf War. The recession then hurt him. So the vice president likely still would have faced a stiff challenge. But had the president not been impeached, a lot of these cultural issues, the cultural conservative issues, might not have factored nearly as much.
Well, clearly a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking going on tonight and will continue to go on in the days ahead. But, John, you know, there are people who say, well, why Al Gore still, despite the Lewinsky scandal, despite impeachment, could have openly embraced the successes of this administration and said, I had nothing to do with the personal failings of the president, and just been more open and more direct about it, rather than sort of taking one step forward and one step back, as he seemed to do throughout part of the campaign.
He did do that in the primaries when he was forced to step out and say, you know, the president was his friend, but he was repulsed by the president's behavior. What a lot of Democrats don't think he did a very good job at was finding that balance. In the very end, we did hear in the last 72 hours in every speech, and he did say this from time to time, we shouldn't say the vice president never mentioned Bill Clinton, because he did. He would say, Bill, you gave Bill Clinton and I a chance to turn around the economy. But that was generally at a quick passing reference, never about how the Democratic Party had changed. But think again to another ramification. Bill Clinton, love him or hate him, widely regarded as the premier politician of his generation. He was kept in the stable, if you will, because the Gore campaign had such fear that he would turn off swing voters. Had the president not been impeached, the president could have been out campaigning in every state, not just one or two states at the end.
In fact, John King, I was watching President Clinton, courtesy of C-SPAN, Friday night in California, doing one of these ad-lib speeches that he is a master of, resting his forearm on the podium, making the argument in plain, simple, clear language about keeping the prosperity going. And it did occur to me that whatever else you think of Bill Clinton, for good or ill, there is almost nobody who can take a complicated issue and frame it in a way that people can understand and respond to the way the president can. And maybe the problem was that he couldn't transfer that skill to Al Gore.
Well, a lot of Democrats watching Al Gore would agree with that point completely, Jeff, on the point of Social Security and the Bush plan to partially privatize, to allow people to invest some of their payroll taxes in private accounts. The vice president made a case against it, but if you timed out that little portion of his speech, often it would take a minute, 2 minutes or more. One of even Gore's staffers said the other day that's something Bill Clinton would do in 20 seconds and people would understand it. So the vice president, obviously not the communicator that the president is. Everybody knew that coming into this race. Al Gore, one of the reasons he said he would run as his own man, one of the reasons in every speech he said, I may not be the flashiest politician, but I will stand by you and fight by you. He tried to cast himself as the anti-Clinton in a good way, saying that he might be a little stiff, but that he would be truthful and honest and always stand by his people. And we hear the crowd firing up a bit behind me. I'm going to turn around. They see some of the staffers coming out and the security forces coming out to check the stage to make sure all is well. There will be a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking, a lot of questioning of the vice president's political skills.
John, I wanted to, Bill Schneider, just to ask you a quick question. The Bush campaign people just said that they thought George Bush won it in the debates. Do the Gore people believe that the debates were really a very bad experience for Al Gore and that they made some serious mistakes there?
Yes, they do, because if you go back and look at the polling data, he had quite a bounce out of the Democratic convention, a pretty good week afterwards as he and Joe Lieberman traveled the country. Then there was a bit of a pause, and they believed that if they had a strong first debate, top Gore aides were saying before that first debate in Boston that they thought it could be a knockout punch. They were going that far as to say they thought if the vice president turned in a strong performance in debate one, that the race would be over then. Now, obviously, something quite different happened. Governor Bush acquitted himself quite well by all accounts, including those among Democrats. Democrats said he wouldn't answer this question, or he didn't answer that, or he ducked and dodged this. But in terms of politically coming out of those debates without causing himself any damage, Democrats privately gave him quite a bit of credit, and they were quite upset at the vice president. And we know from sources within the White House, among those who thought the vice president did not handle himself well and was not aggressive enough in defending the administration's record and running on it, was the president himself.